most people's introduction to Vita Sackville-West came via the writer Virginia Woolf, their affair, and Woolf's novel Orlando. But in their day, Vita was the more popular writer, despite her rather scandalous private life.
Ooh.
We begin in March 1892 with her birth to cousins Victoria Sackville-West and Lionel Sackville-West, the third Baron Sackville. She was named after her mother, hence the need for a nickname, Vita.
Can I just say, cousins marrying and she gets named after her mother? Like that's a bit much, even for the aristocracy.
Not really, I think. I mean, her mother's the daughter, illegitimate daughter of the previous Baron Sackville, and she married her cousin who was her father's heir.
So it was strategic, but it's just that's a choice.
It not only strategic, they were apparently very mad for each other up until like a year after Vita's birth.
Ooh.
Because you see, her mother very quickly decided that Vita would be an only child because she really did not want to go through pregnancy and childbirth again. This despite the fact that Vita is not a boy, and only a boy could inherit the family's manor house, Knoll, and the title of her father. This legal system would plague Vita for the rest of her life.
And her mother's thinking, yeah, she can't marry her cousin because that's just a bit too much cousin marriage.
Have you looked at Royal European family trees at any point?
Yeah, I have. And have you looked at those Wikipedia articles talking about all the various genetic diseases those people had?
I have. I have also seen that there are current British royals who have gone bald way before anyone else usually does.
So Vita is just gonna lose Null as far as we know.
Vita is just going to lose Noel unless, unlike with her alter ego Orlando, she undergoes a sudden sex change that no one questions.
Right. And because they're definitely gonna have that technology at that time.
Like many of the time, Vita's parents didn't spend much time raising her. She was passed off to household staff, hence why her two parents didn't pause their trips abroad to celebrate her first birthday.
Yeah, this is definitely not what we in middle class America are used to.
Like many only children left to their own devices, though, she created a vivid, extensive inner world. This is not to say that her parents didn't influence her, though. As one biographer notes, Vita probably inherited her tendency to inflict pain casually on others from her mother.
Oh, yeah, great things that we're getting from our parents.
For instance, when the Boer War occurred in 1898, she befriended a local boy and terrorized girls by whacking them with nettles in strange reenactments of battles she would hear about. As she grew older, she also started writing stories, and she wrote very quickly. She said the day after one was finished, she started another. Many were historical novels. And then at age 15 in 1907, she won a small amount of money for a magazine writing contest.
Ooh, getting recognized already.
Her parents were not thrilled.
Excuse me?
The upper class, and especially upper class women of the time, were not to work.
Wow, so they really gave her some inbreeding genes, absence, a tendency to cause pain, and absolutely no encouragement in her talents. Love these parents.
By then, she had been friends with Violet Keppel for 2 years. As noted in the previous episode, the two girls became fast friends, partially out of loneliness. Another friend was Rosamund Grosvenor. Meanwhile, her parents' marriage was collapsing and her mother took a lover, a man named Siri. Her father also had his affairs. This is not to say that her privileged childhood, aside from her parents' problems, was idyllic. At 16, she was nearly raped and frequently harassed by Kenneth Campbell, the son of Lord Campbell and a man much older than herself.
Among all of the various horrible things in the aristocracy, there's protecting horrible guys like that.
There is, and then at 18, her schooling came to an end and her path seemed set to follow the social norm marriage.
So is she gonna go for a cousin or not?
None of her suitors were her cousins,
Thank goodness for that, at least.
probably in part because the one cousin she was close friends with was gay.
That would do it.
She has several offers from a duke, an earl, and from the diplomat Harold Nicholson, who by comparison is penniless and titleless.
Oh, only a diplomat.
She didn't feel much for them except for Harold, who took 2 years to kiss her and then she decided she loved him afterwards.
Oh.
Despite this, she was also having an affair with Rosamund, which didn't seem conflicting to her.
Oh, well, it's different when it's with a woman, as all unicorn hunters know.
Yes, but also remember that tendency to just casually and unconsciously inflict pain on people. This is where we
Hmm.
start to see it.
Let's see if Rosamund is on that same page with her, or
She is not, as we will see. Now, on the marriage front, she does settle on marrying Harold, which was prevented for a time by the mourning period after Ceres, her mother's lover's, death.
that's kind of sweet. I mean, if nothing, like those horrible aristocracy people are all being horrible to each other, but at least they're like recognizing this partnership.
The two do finally marry in October 1913. Violet didn't attend.
No,
Rosamund
really.
Rosamund was the principal bridesmaid, though she cried the entire night before as the wedding put an end to her affair with Vita.
Oh no, that's the saddest thing.
Vita did not find it sad.
He's just like, next.
Well, you see, Vita would say things like, "She is a stupid little thing and her conventionality drives me mad," and also noted that she knew she had no business to sleep with Rosamund, but she didn't care.
Wow. Okay. A lot of disdain for a partner. It's like they were not on the same page.
They were not, they were also not intellectually compatible.
Hmm.
Harold, on the other hand, was intellectually compatible with her. And speaking of Harold, after the marriage, she moved with him to Constantinople, also known as Istanbul, where he was posted for work. Despite disliking the month long journey through Venice and Cairo to get there, she loved the city. The city inspired her to write poetry, for instance, that focused on the abandoned garden of the house they took in the city. And speaking of gardening, it shows up a little bit in Constantinople since they don't have much time or space for it, but it is something that will reoccur rather frequently and become a major part of Vita's life later on. And then World War One ended that life.
Oh no. So they just figured it out.
Exempt from the draft, Harold worked in London, and Vita by then had her first child, Ben. However, they had their own trials and tribulations, despite the fact that Harold was not at risk of getting shot or killed. Their second son, born in 1915, was stillborn. The war also brought a shift in their marriage. Harold had never stopped seeing men when they married, and Vita became aware of this when he contracted a venereal disease, forcing her to get tested and to pause their sex life after the birth of their third son, Nigel.
So he's a bicon. Did she know that he had had relationships with men before this?
No, she had not been aware at all.
Wow. Did he know about her relationships with women?
Yes, because she would write to him about Rosamond, and though I don't think it's explicitly stated, he could have picked up on it.
Yeah, especially if he's also bi. Wow. So this is a complete shock, and not the best way to figure out that your partner has decided you're polyamorous.
Well, in Harold's case, it's not so much polyamorous as open, because to him, the men were only more about sex. And as he would say in his breakdown, confessing that he contracted some STD and that they both needed to get tested and he had to go through this months long treatment, he would say that there's only been you, I've only ever loved you, that sort of thing.
Gotcha.
Not long after this revelation, Violet came to visit Vita at the couple's new home, Longbarn. By the end of her stay, she and Vita had embarked on the most passionate and scandalous affair of both their lives.
Oh, a lesbian's not gonna cheat on you with a bunch of men.
As we went over in last month's episode, the two, with the help of Harold, decamped to Cornwall for a spur of the moment holiday. While Violet ditched every flirtation immediately, Vita did not fling Harold overboard, though he was off at work constantly and rarely even at their house for months at a time. So now things settle into a lopsided love triangle between the three, where Vita held all the cards and was reluctant to give up anyone. Harold was not exactly amused, as he was alone in London and by then clear of the STD. In fact, Violet basically showed up on their doorstep about a week before Harold was in the clear.
Oh, so he was big mad.
According to Vita, she expected the affair to not last long. Violet, as we've seen, was of the opposite opinion, but Vita did have a completely separate life of being a diplomat's wife and the mother of two kids, even if she was more distant with them than is socially acceptable today.
This really does shine light on the situation because when you get it all from Violet's perspective, you're like, dang, Vita is heartless. But here you're like, well, why would she drop her entire life to go off and be lesbians with her childhood friend?
It is that, and there is the fact that she does love Harold in her own way, and Vita is rather selfish as it comes out when you look at her entire life and how she treats different people. There's a caringness, but also inevitably a pull back and run away.
So this is one instance in which maybe Violet's coming on a bit too strong for Vita's liking.
Eventually, yes, but at the beginning, she's just lost in the hurricane that is Violet.
Fair enough.
The war ended soon in 1918, and the two immediately took off for France, where Vita would sometimes dress up as the character version of herself, Julian, from the joint novel Challenge, that they were writing. Harold again helped with travel arrangements. Their novel was not published back then. Vita's mother would see to that after deeming it too shocking, though we do see it in print now, a century later. Outrage and shock also followed the two in real life on occasion. At one point, they left a hotel in a flurry after causing outrage by dancing together in public.
Not bad.
People were also getting antsy as the two didn't always let anyone know where they were. Harold wrote to a mutual friend in a fuss, saying he put the whole mess down to that swine Violet who seems to addle your brain. Still, the two women spent Christmas at Monaco. As pressures mounted, and as neither actually had her own money, Violet only had an allowance from her mother, and Vita's finances were tied with Harold's through legal and social conventions. The two returned to England in March. Soon after, it was announced that Violet was engaged to Dennis Trefusis, an officer and veteran of World War I. Vita was not pleased.
What gives her the right? She's literally married.
Because Vita is very sexually possessive, and when it comes to the people she's with, she very much likes possessing them completely, in a way. And as you'll see, there's a lot of her lovers relying on her for this, that, and the other. Eventually drives her away, but also she kind of likes it's. There's a difference basically in how she acts with Harold and how she acts with everyone else.
I'm getting sort of early Natalie Barney vibes.
And not quite the same as Natalie Barney, because the way I've read it explained is Vita plays a more feminine, think of traditional woman's role with Harold to an extent, but with women and especially with Violet, she sort of saw herself more in the character of Julian, this much more cruel, masculine persona. Very adventurous, very romantic, but very not as caring.
Yeah, I can see like her kind of dated understanding of masculinity as both encompassing like this coolness and also this possessiveness and this like controllingness. It's kind of a weird contradiction though.
People are complicated.
People are complicated. But I think we were talking about Violet's marriage.
We were talking about Violet's marriage, well, engagement at this point. This whole announcement begins Vita's back and forth on whether or not to dump Violet or even believe her when Violet says she wants nothing to do with Dennis. Personally, I would say Vita was looking for an excuse to leave the relationship. Despite this, the relationship dragged on. After Violet married Dennis Trefusis in 1919, the two took off again when the newlyweds returned from their honeymoon. Violet wanted to elope. Vita was unsure and persuaded her to postpone any elopement till February 1920, but she also wrote to Harold that she loved him deeply.
I'm getting some mixed messages.
It's about to get even more mixed. February saw the planned elopement very quickly derail like a runaway train. Vita's heart wasn't in it. She sent Violet ahead of her across the channel. Then she sent telegrams to Harold and everyone else she could think of to save her from this decision. I have no idea why she didn't just tell Violet she didn't want to do this and just walk away, but
Well,
this is
classic indecisive bisexuals.
and this is how Dennis found her. And then the two traveled across to France while he confided that he intended to leave Violet once they got there.
Again, as I said in the Violet episode, what it would have been like to be at that conversation. I can't even imagine what that interaction would have looked like.
Awkward, but we do know that Vita and Dennis got on rather well, that initially, when there wasn't an engagement, that Vita actually rather liked Dennis, comparing him to the acolyte searching for the Holy Grail. From Calais, Vita and Violet traveled inland, and Dennis left for England again. During this whole time, Vita continued to wire people, which is how George Keppel, Violet's legal father, found them and then demanded Dennis come at once. Tired of trains, he decided to take a plane and Harold went with him. Then followed a very heated confrontation with suspicions that Violet slept with Dennis, which provided a convenient excuse to leave. Vita seized said excuse, caused a scene screaming in the hotel, rushed upstairs to pack, and left with Harold. This despite both Violet and Dennis saying that they had never had anything of the kind between them.
Once again, I'll just say, how dare you sleep with your husband? I, who sleep with my husband and love him, think it's so horrible that you, a lesbian, might sleep with your husband.
I mean, I do think it horrible for a lesbian to sleep with a husband she doesn't want, but
Yeah, but she probably didn't.
true, but Vita doesn't really care. It's a good excuse to pull herself out of this situation.
Finally make up her mind without communicating. Whatever. Whatever.
She and Harold did not immediately return to England. Instead, they spent a few days in Paris where Vita reread novels, prepped for the publication of Challenge, which didn't go through as we discussed earlier, and distracted herself by staring at half naked women when the chance occurred. This was not to be the end, though. Weeks later, she and Violet went on a trip to Venice with Violet's friend and Vita's one time lover, Pat Dancy, as chaperone. The trip was a misery.
Mm-hmm.
There was no saving this relationship. There would be one more trip abroad in 1921, and then they wouldn't see each other again for years. However, this did not mean that Vita's relationship with Harold returned to what it was. They remained married, but Vita now joined in on having affairs, what Harold called her muddles, which resulted in 3 broken marriages.
Yes, he can be forgiven for calling them that.
We'll see a few more of these soon enough, but in the meantime, Vita continued to write. She had already published several works before embarking on a very long poem called The Land, which is about the traditions of the English countryside. As we'll see, Vita developed a lifelong love of gardening, which shows up most in her last house. But back to the broken marriages.
Ah, yes.
While she technically met Dorothy Wellesley in 1914 in Constantinople, she only got to know Dottie, as she was nicknamed, in 1921 when she traveled with her and Dottie's husband to Italy, followed by Dottie spending time at Long Barn, Vita's house. They soon became lovers, scandalizing servants, one of whom claimed to have seen them in a very amorous position, with no clothes on. Not that this caused problems.
No. No, it's very chill.
The real problems came from Vita playing both lover and mother to a woman who needed emotional support more than sex, and when said woman's husband got involved.
Yeah, Vita's partners can't have husbands.
This is the first marriage to fall apart, if you're not counting the Trefusis marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And in a pattern we'll see every time, The more Vita's lover pulled at her attention and time, the more Vita pulled away and abandoned the affair.
Oh no. Yeah, a muddle.
Now, in the parade of women, there was one man, Geoffrey Scott, a fellow writer. It has been suggested their affair from 1923 to 1925 spurred him into a surge of literary production. It also helped along the divorce from his wife, Sibylle.
No, really.
While both Harold and Geoffrey grew increasingly unhappy, the invitation from Harold for Vita to journey with him to his new posting in Tehran, Persia, proved a useful escape route from this affair.
Love it. So at this point, Harold knows. Harold knows that Vita just wants out.
Well, you see, Vita always communicated with Harold, including about her muddles. This was also a choice made with Vita in mind, as Harold could have gone to Peking instead, which is modern Beijing. You see, Vita resented being a diplomat's wife. You see, the truth was, Vita wanted Harold to have no career except her own one of writing. She described it as his legitimate pursuit and her own pastime of gardening. You love foreign politics, and I love literature and peace and a secluded life. Oh, my dear, my infinitely dear Hedgie, you ought never to have married me.
Wow, okay.
I mean, if he'd married someone else, he might not have had to constantly move around the world on his own and distract and save his wife from entangling affairs. But would another woman have been fine with him catching an STD from one of his male lovers?
Right, yeah. No, I think that they're having some bicon times. They're really both good enough for each other, I think.
By now, Vita has also met the writer Virginia Woolf.
Ooh.
Now, we should note that at the time, Vita was the more popular and well known writer, the one who actually made money writing. Funny, actually, that today the reverse is true. While the trip finally killed off the affair with Geoffrey, Virginia wasn't dissuaded. Prior to the trip, Virginia actually stayed 3 days at Longbarn, and she wrote, Vita dazzled her guest without any conscious effort. She shines in the grocer's shop in Severn Oaks with a candle-lit radiance stalking on legs like beech trees, pink glowing grape clustered pearl hung.
I don't know about you, but that sounds kind of gay.
There was also talk of Vita publishing books for Virginia and her husband's press because they didn't make much money. And Vita was pretty much always guaranteed to make money with her novels. And speaking of gay, at the time Vita was reassuring Harold that she did not love Virginia in a backstairs, meaning gay, way. He was afraid he'd have another Violet situation to contend with here.
Yeah, well, not surprising given Vita's track record.
He need not have worried. It did not turn into a Violet situation. The two would be close, yes, but it was to Harold that Vita dedicated her next book, Passenger to Tehran. This while Virginia was fretting, since at one point Vita's train caught fire, and letters, as Vita wrote, could be quite troublesome, as they do not arrive often enough. Not to mention the fact you could write it in Cairo, and by the time someone reads it, you're already in Baghdad and have acquired a dog from Gertrude Bell to go with your car on the drive to Tehran, though without mention of Dottie traveling with you for a time.
That's oddly specific. I wonder if that happened.
It did. She did stop in Baghdad and meet the archaeologist and just a great woman, Gertrude Bell. You can think of her as the female Lawrence of Arabia.
Sounds like an interesting character for a later date.
Later, one of the few straights, but anyway. Meanwhile, Virginia is reading Vita's alphabet letter, which in a shortened version goes, the only way I can deal with Egypt is alphabetically. Alabaster, Americans, Arabs, bromides, buffalo, beggars, camels, crocodiles, colossi, dust, dervishes, desert, Egyptians, elation, fellaheen, flies, goats, granite, hotels, hieroglyphics, imshi, ignorance, jivas, kodaks, levantines, mummies, mud, millionaires, Nubia, obsidian, pyramids, quarries, ruins, sarcophagi, Tutankhamun, utopia, vultures, Virginia.
Oh. Can I just say that's a bit out of order? Vultures should go after Virginia, but whatever.
It works better when you're trying to woo someone epistolarily.
Right, and you put vultures right before their name. Hot. But I mean, it worked, so.
It did work. Virginia replied, "You are a crafty fox to write an alphabet letter." Admittedly, I much prefer their first letters, which go, "Dear Mrs. Nicholson, but I wish you could be induced to call me Virginia," followed
Ooh.
by, "My dear Virginia, you see I don't take much inducing. Could you be induced likewise, do you think?"
Ooh. Yeah, there is something nice about a letter sometimes.
But they take so very long to arrive. And Vita did not stay long in Persia, thankfully, though she would return in 1927, which resulted in another book on her travels. 1927 also brought Mary Campbell into Vita's orbit because Vita frequently ends up in love triangles, or quadrangles, or even quintangles. She was married to the South African poet Roy Campbell, a marriage destroyed by Vita's involvement.
Again.
This also provoked jealousy in Virginia, who wrote, "Heart you have none who go gallivanting down the lanes with Campbell."
Yeah, seriously.
Harold put in his 2 cents, saying Vita lacked a happy touch where married couples were concerned.
I'll say.
I like to imagine this is code for, "Please stop getting involved with married women."
Right? Can she not find any single women?
By 1928, Virginia had conceived of Orlando, a book that was her way of claiming a piece of Vita through turning her into its hero heroine, since the protagonist undergoes a sex change in the middle of the century's spanning text. Vita loved that it gave her Knoll, a house she'd recently lost due to her father's death because it went solely to male heirs.
Now, do we know if Vita had any sense of gender nonconformity? I mean, we've mentioned that she is cross-dressed before and that she takes more of a masculine role with her female lovers.
If you're asking if she's trans or non binary, the answer is no.
Gotcha.
The cross dressing and so forth is just a way of dealing with the fact she likes women and the fact that she can't have Noel because she's a woman and all the social bullshit and whatnot that goes on at this time.
Gotcha. So it's more of a response to the constrictive nature of the female gender role of that era that, now when women are more allowed to like women, she might not feel as and are allowed to own property. She might feel less of a compulsion to be masculine in those circumstances.
Yes, but I hate to break it to you. In the
Mhm.
UK, to this day, there's a great many women who cannot inherit houses like Noel because they are not men.
'Cause it's still a thing? Wow. Love that. British aristocracy, keep winning. So and we can never know for sure about any historical figure, but that sounds pretty conclusive about her gender expression.
But back to Orlando. The book, not the character.
Mhm.
The book's decorations were actually portraits and photos of Vita, who then received a special leather bound copy. It was a bestseller, with many recognizing Vita in the character. As the writer Radcliffe Hall wrote to Vita, "It must have been you because it was someone who looked so exactly like Orlando."
Wow. Now, this was different from other lesbian fictions that we've seen that have been recognized in that it was not like a damage to her reputation, right?
It was not a damage to her reputation, though her mother was not pleased, and prior to the publication, Vita was quite nervous about it.
Mhm.
That being said, she delighted in it. In fact, she gave a copy or some book to Mary Campbell afterwards, not long afterwards, and literally inscribed it from Orlando.
Oh, well. Alright.
The book also resulted in Vita finally whisking Virginia abroad for 6 days in France, another habit of Vita's when it came to her affairs. A habit that usually signaled the imminent end of the relationship.
Ooh, okay.
That being said, they would continue to write to each other, and even in 5 or 6 years after the relationship ended, there would be letters like, "Dear Mrs. Woolf, that appears to be the suitable formula. I regret that you have been in bed, though not with me, a less suitable formula."
Ooh.
Amidst all this, Vita's still writing. She had a book of verse, King's Daughter, appear in 1929. By now, she has 12 to 14 works in print at the age of 37.
Wow.
That's quite prolific because writing is actually exhausting once you get into it.
And you would know.
And then she starts live broadcasts at the newly created BBC.
Wow, she's doing everything.
Yes, but it's possibly because she now refused to take the allowance from her mother that she'd had for over a decade now after a public falling out screaming episode over a pearl necklace gift.
Excuse me? Is okay. Is this rich people BS or is there actually something behind this?
As we've gone over before, Vita's mother did not like the overt lesbianism or scandalous affairs or anything like she'd had, and also that her mother was quite mercurial in nature. So there are times where they had quite a lot of fighting. This occasion was about 12 extra pearls she had added to a pearl necklace that was Vita's posthumous 21st birthday present from her ex lover, Siri. However, when she surprised Vita, there was floods of vile abuse, like a mad woman screaming thief and liar and shaking her fist at me till I thought she was going to hit me, because Victoria demanded the return of her dozen pearls.
Well, all right.
This continued even out into a London street, where Vita then broke apart the necklace and handed over the pearls. Her mother screamed that she hated her, hoped she would die then and there, and that very minute, standing in the street, run over by a bus, and then sent her secretary after Vita to demand the return of all the other jewels she had ever given her. And then her mother began to abuse Harold, and Vita took refuge in a taxi.
Dang. Sometimes rich people don't have enough problems, so they just create problems.
And so that is the story of how Vita now has less money than she has before. And the BBC did provide an income. It also provided love. Mary was gone, Dottie was intermittent, Virginia was sailing into friendship, albeit without grace, as we will see, and Hilda Matheson was the BBC Director of Talks. How convenient.
How convenient indeed.
The relationship followed the pattern of the others: obsession, physical rhapsody, letters, concealment, a holiday abroad, friendship at the end. Virginia did not like her, thought her a middle class intellectual, drab and dreary.
Rude.
In fact, she only reluctantly agreed to do her own talk at the BBC and then complained about it afterwards.
Do we still have that, by the way? Does that audio exist somewhere?
Yes, and you can find it on YouTube. Now, I don't think I really need to mention this, but do take what Virginia says about Hilda with a grain of salt, since the woman is quite jealous.
Hmm.
1930 then brought its own upheaval. Vita found Sissinghurst, a decrepit old tower with outbuildings, after Dottie mentioned it was for sale. Vita fell in love at first sight and bought it. As one biographer noted, she was in a mood to fall in love with Tudor ruins. The upheaval from her relationships had settled, Noel was gone, and she now craved privacy, as she told Mary Campbell. A tower with 450 acres sounded like a great idea.
I mean, yeah, sounds like a good idea to me too.
That and the Edwardians came out, where the guy complains of too many people and too much industrialism. A complaint I can just hear Vita making.
Now, the Edwardians was a book.
Yes, it was another of her novels.
Gotcha. Because when you say the Edwardians came out, I'm like, what? All of them?
Yes, every Edwardian is secretly not straight. They all came out of the closet at once and yelled surprise.
Mhm. And that's why we had to make the podcast. The end.
Anyway, Harold eventually agreed with her enthusiasm, which solidified more when she found a previous owner's daughter had married a Sackville in the 1500s.
The 1500s. You always forget as an American, like how old these British families are, like how long they've kept that money in their clutches.
She would then go ahead and put the Sackville-West coat of arms and her initials on the building later. The 1930s were now to be devoted to rebuilding and restructuring the property, with the addition of a grand garden created by both her and Harold.
Oh, that's actually really sweet, like, reflection of their relationship that they're, like, working together to make things grow.
This is not to say she stopped having affairs.
No, of course not.
Oh no, she had several minor affairs and then met the journalist Evelyn Irons when she went to interview Vita. This quickly became a new love triangle with Evelyn, Vita, and Evelyn's girlfriend, Olive Rinder. And just to try and clear up the very complicated timeline, Hilda is gone, Mary is gone, Dottie is gone, Virginia is a friend.
Gotcha, so it's only a triangle,
At this point in time, it is only a triangle.
and only
However,
one triangle, not, like, 2 separate triangles.
I mean, it almost turns into two separate triangles because this affair would not exactly follow the script. Evelyn was the one who left Vita and not the other way around in the end.
What? It can happen to Vita too?
She dumped our protagonist for Joy McSweeney in 1932.
What about Olive?
Olive was still around, suffering from tuberculosis and now homeless.
Wow, okay.
Vita supported her for a while and found her a bungalow to stay in until she died.
Yeah, well, that's that classic sapphic case of the ex of my ex is my friend.
We're not going with what you said last time, the ex of my ex is my ex.
Well, well, presumably she and Olive don't date, but I'm not gonna say that didn't happen.
I mean, Vita did date Olive.
Yeah, so there you go. The ex of my ex is my ex. I forgot I said anything.
Soon there were only friendships, and Vita seemed fine with that as she retreated more into the countryside. Rather than settling, though, she simply directed her impulses into creating Sissinghurst rather than having muddles. Meanwhile, Harold journeyed into politics, which came with a brush with Oswald Mosley's Blackshirts.
And who are these?
British fascists,
Oh,
though
cute.
though they're not the original British fascists. That's a mouthful. Because British fascism was actually created by a woman.
And we'll of course have to get to that later.
In the meantime, though, World War II started.
Fun times.
Both her sons joined the army and survived the war. With Hilda's help, she recorded broadcasts in French in 1940 for Radio Paris. However, deaths still occurred. Hilda died after an operation in October 1940. Virginia committed suicide in 1941. Shaken, Vita wrote her an obituary poem. Rosamond Grosvenor then died in a bombing in 1944. Dottie, meanwhile, descended into alcoholism, and Violet was forced to flee France for England, which resulted in a strained meeting and not quite friendship.
Oh, so World War II really did a number on everyone, didn't it?
It does with every episode, it seems. Now, the gaggle of girlfriends that had miffed Virginia vanished into thin air, Virginia with them. To make matters worse, Knoll and Longbarn were damaged by bombs.
And we know how much importance Vita places on these places.
Vita is also struggling to write as a distraction, is suffering arthritis in her spine, taking meds, and drinking sherry.
Oof, is this becoming an alcoholism problem?
It doesn't appear to be so, but it is not ideal. At one point, she worried she was falling in love with Violet again.
Oh no. They've had enough drama.
Then she worried that her son Ben was falling in love with Violet after the two met, since Violet was his godmother at her own sarcastic request.
Oof, that's a bit too much baggage.
Neither actually occurred. They just ended up friends who'd meet whenever Violet was in England. The war finally ended. It brought writing, working with the National Trust, Harold losing his seat in government, a medal for horticulture in 1954, and Alvild Lee's Mill, who oddly enough the Nicholsons had witnessed her marry her husband in 1951. Even odder, her husband James had been Harold's lover in the 1930s.
I love that. Bi solidarity all around.
I mean, Alvild herself had had an affair with Renée Singer, who'd had an affair with Violet, who had an affair with Vita. It
Mhm.
just all comes full circle.
Mhm.
While it didn't last long, it did spur Vita to write poetry again, though she was worried that her letters to Elvield were being tampered with. The thought of exposure terrified Vita, unlike it had in 1919 when she ran around in public with Violet.
Hmm. I guess this is the 50s. There's more like we've hit one of those points of constriction in the culture.
2 steps forward, 1 step back, spin your partner around and drop them in the sink.
Yes. That's the gay repression dance. Woo!
Despite the problems of age, Vita remained writing and traveling. At one point, she and Harold took a cruise to Indonesia, the West Indies, South Africa, and South America. During that, she worked on her final novel, No Signposts in the Sea. She died of abdominal cancer in June 1962 at the age of 70. She lived long enough to hear of her uncle's death and her cousin Eddie inheriting Noel, which he then abandoned in favor of his Irish estate.
Excuse me?
As she told Harold, fancy inheriting Noel and leaving it. Her funeral was simple and at a nearby church. Harold followed her to the grave in 1968 after transferring Sissinghurst to the hands of the National Trust, who today run it and allow visitors to tour its gardens. Thank you for listening. Subscribe wherever you are. And remember, if you're going to have a gaggle of girlfriends, practice effective communication.